I'm Bradley Hart at the National WWII Museum. On July 16, 1945, the United States tested the world's first atomic bomb. It was called the Trinity Test. Less than a month later, an American B-29 bomber would drop a single atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It would be followed by the dropping of a second atomic bomb on the southern city of Nagasaki just days later. Those moments changed the course of history and shaped the world we live in today. On the 80th anniversary of the Trinity Test, author Garrett M. Graff joined me at the National WWII Museum in New Orleans to talk about his new book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb. Well, Garrett Graff, an honor and a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming, braving the weather here to be with us on this momentous anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the detonation of the world's first atomic bomb, essentially, atomic device in Los Alamos. It's a fascinating book and a fascinating title, and I think I have to start with a question about the title of the book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, with the intriguing subtitle, An Oral History of the Making and Unleashing of the Atomic Bomb, so a written oral history, as several of your books are. I wonder if you could talk to us about how you chose the title, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, and how did you come up with the idea for the book, given that you're the author of so many works in different parts of American history? How did you come to this topic?
Yeah, so this is my third book-length volume of oral history. And if you are not familiar with the form, it tries to tell events through the first-person experiences of the people who lived them. And so this book brings together the voices of about 500 people from all sides of the history of physics and atoms, to the team that does the Manhattan Project, to the men of the 509th Composite Group, which is the Army Air Force unit that comes together to deliver the atomic bombs from Tinian to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then also in the book's final chapters, the voices of the survivors in Japan. To me, there's a unique power that comes in oral history, in that I think when we write narrative history, and I've written plenty of narrative history. My Watergate book was a narrative history where you sort of try to be omniscient and sort of know all of the facts and tell the reader all of the facts as they unfold. But we forget how none of these events were as preordained to the people who were living them as they feel to us now as history. My 9/11 book, The Only Plane in the Sky, came out in 2019, and it also was about 500 voices, 480 voices of people who lived 9/11 in America, morning to night, coast to coast. And at that 18th anniversary, you're just beginning to see history. You're just beginning to see those events slip from memory into history. That 18th anniversary in 2019 was the first time we had men and women entering the US military, going off to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan in wars that began before they were born. It was the first time you had firefighters entering FDNY who were born after the day that 343 of their colleagues were killed in a way that was sort of still roiling the department, and the department was still trying to understand. And the story that those people learned in their history books about 9/11 is this story of the whole thing begins at 8:46 in the morning. There are 4 planes, 4 attacks, Pennsylvania, New York, Washington. The whole thing is over 102 minutes later at 10:28 with the collapse of the second tower, and 3,000 people die. Now, looking out at this audience, at least some of you appear to be old enough to remember 9/11, like I am. And that's not the day that any of us actually lived. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks ended. We didn't know how many attacks there were for most of the course of that day. We didn't know how many people had died. We didn't know how many hijacked planes there were until well into the end of that day. And so when we teach 9/11 as history now, what we miss is the fear and the confusion and the trauma of that day. And if you take away teaching in 9/11 the fear and the confusion and the trauma of that day, you miss why America reacted to 9/11 in the way that America reacts. And in a weird way, World War II right now is at the exact opposite end of that arc of memory. So, last year we had the 80th anniversary of D-Day. When my D-Day book came out, this year we're marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. And I think the 80th anniversary feels so poignant to us because it is an unofficial marker of the passing of the last of the generation who actually fought World War II. These events that were experienced on the scale of hundreds of thousands, we're now down to a few dozen, a few hundred people who are still living who remember, this event or that event. And we are watching World War II pass entirely from living memory into history. And so my goal with the D-Day book last year and then this one this year with the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombs is we have at this moment effectively every first-person memory we will ever have of D-Day, of the Manhattan Project, of the atomic bombings. We have effectively every memory we will ever have of the Hayabusa, the bomb-affected people, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I wanted to try to set out to tell D-Day last year and the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb now, using this trove of effectively every first-person memory we will ever have of these events to try to put us back in the shoes of the people who lived these events firsthand with all of the uncertainty and fear and sort of lack of awareness of whether these things would work, whether the thing that they were doing would make any difference to anyone, and then, what the arc of World War II actually would turn out to be. I think one of the things that really comes through when you get into, for instance, the first-person histories of the start of the Manhattan Project that I think we sort of forget in the way that we sort of so closely associate now the atomic bombs with Japan and the end of the war in the Pacific, is the story of the atomic bomb is almost entirely a story of the war in Europe. It is the rise of fascism and Hitler and authoritarianism and the Third Reich in Europe that drives this incredibly brilliant set of scientists out of Germany and Denmark and other countries, often first to England and then to the United States, where what they're terrified about is they arrive on America's shores terrified that Hitler is going to build the bomb. And that for them, for their work in Los Alamos, their work in Oak Ridge, their work at the University of Chicago, their work in Hanford, Washington, sort of the major sites of what we now shorthand as the Manhattan Project, they wake up every day thinking that Werner Heisenberg and his team are probably ahead of them, and that they fear that they are behind through most of the development of the atomic bomb, and sort of fear that Hitler's going to get the bomb first and Hitler's going to win the war. And it wouldn't take Hitler having that many atomic bombs for England and the U.S. to be like, let's really reconsider this whole thing. it's really only in those last couple of months of the war that you see people in Los Alamos begin to be like, oh, wait, no, actually, like, this thing's going to get used against Japan. Like, this is, and that's actually where their moral qualms as scientists first come to the fore, is they're like, we didn't get into this to bomb the Japanese people. Like, we wanted to stop Hitler. Hitler stopped. Let's not even bother using this thing. And that's where you really begin to see sort of this shift just over the course of the spring of 1945, where they realize that their weapon that they have worked so hard on, there's this one like really poignant scene in the book where University of Chicago, they're trying to build the first atomic reactor. They're trying to prove that they can create a chain reacting pile at the University of Chicago. And they have a day shift working and a night shift working. There's sort of someone who recalls one of the other scientists who had just worked the night shift coming in early the next morning before the day shift even starts. And he's asked why he's there. Hey, you just got off the midnight shift. And he's like, someone in Germany is up working on this bomb right now. And I figured I couldn't sleep and I best get in here to try to outwork Hitler.
I think what's fascinating about what you just said is that 9/11 comparison of that's not how anyone experienced it in the way that narrative history presents it. And certainly that's true of the Trinity test as well. I mean, this was not front page news across the country, deliberately so, right? We often think of this as the atomic test happens, then the bombs are dropped a few weeks later. That was sort of an inevitable sort of narrative link, and everyone sort of knew that was going to happen. Not true at all, right? What you point out.
And like, they're standing there and they don't know that it's going to work.
Right. Right.
Kenneth Bainbridge, who's the sort of chief of the Trinity test, his sort of final thought as the Trinity test is ticking down is he's like, if this thing doesn't go off, it's going to be my job to go down to the bomb and try to figure out why it didn't work. Like, I'm the guy who, like, when this fizzles, is going to be, like, walking down through the desert to sort of, like, tap on the outside and see if I can get this thing to blow up.
It's an enviable job right there, yeah.
Like, this is, I think that there is part of what I really try to do in the book, and I think the power that you get out of trying to go back and relive this history through the eyes of the people who experienced it, is it gives you that sense of the unknown. It gives you the sense that, like, we all know Trinity works. We know the bombs end World War II, or we can get into that later, but we know that the bombs come very close to the end of the war. They don't know that. Like, they're standing there, they're taking bets on, how much is the bomb gonna go off? The night before, the scientists are sitting around, walking around the lab in Los Alamos, debating one more time, like, are we pretty sure that this isn't going to ignite the atmosphere? Like, we were concerned about that earlier on and have pretty much relieved our concerns that this is actually going to ignite all of the hydrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere and cause the entire world to explode. But, like, we should be really doubly sure of that before we set this bomb off tomorrow morning.
I want to ask you about one of the sort of mythologies around the actual Trinity test, which is the famous quote from J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist, where we can talk about this in a sec, but he says later that he thought when that moment happens that he had this quote from the Gita that comes into his mind where he says, "Now I'm become death, destroyer of worlds." As far as I can tell, there's no contemporaneous sort of collaboration or corroboration, I should say, that actually took place.
Yeah, and it's probably the most famous quote of the Trinity test, and there's no contemporaneous reporting that he actually says it. He does say when he recalls it in the TV interview that he thought it, so maybe he did, but that is definitely not the posture that he has sort of there. And it's a really sort of celebratory atmosphere after it comes off. And I've finished the Trinity chapter with a quote from Norris Bradbury, who's one of the physicists, who says, I won't get the quote exactly right off the top of my head here, but he says basically, there was later a lot of thought that we were having these moral qualms about this bomb. I didn't. We were at war and the damn thing worked.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating insight. We'll talk more about sort of the moral trajectory of the war in the Pacific in a second that leads to the decision to drop the bomb. So I wanted to ask you about another sort of statement you make in the introduction, which visitors to the museum will, of course, be familiar with through our sort of Arsenal of Democracy gallery. But you say explicitly that the war was fought in familiar places like Guadalcanal and Bastogne, the famous battlefields of the war, but it was won in places like Willow Run, places that perhaps for the vast majority of Americans are not familiar places, even if they are World War II experts, and Willow Run being the Ford aircraft plant there. What do you mean by that in terms of America's industrial contribution, especially with the Manhattan Project? Where do you see the linkages there? As being?
And I think that, again, this was part. These sort of three books end up fitting together in a way. 9/11, the most famous single day of the 21st century, D-Day, the most famous single day of the 20th century, and then the Manhattan Project, sort of probably the most important thing that has happened in the world in the 20th and 21st century. I mean, sort of everything in our world is rewritten by the arrival of the atomic bomb. It rewrites politics, it rewrites geopolitics, it rewrites science. But it's not just the atomic bomb that does that. It's the science that goes into the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is this enormous triumph. Like any crisis that happens in modern life, there's a congressman who stands up and says, we need a new Manhattan Project to accomplish this. Manhattan Project and the Apollo program. It's, either a Manhattan Project or a moonshot. And those are the two ways that we sort of express as a society that like something is important and big. Manhattan Project almost doesn't happen. And there is this 2-year period at the start of the war where you have all of these European, mostly Jewish, refugee scientists running around the US to anyone in government that will meet with them and saying, hey, guys, this nuclear fission thing, it's a really big deal. You need to pay attention to it. Like, Hitler's gonna do this. They meet over and over and over again with the military. Military does not care at all. The military is not convinced that this matters at all. Albert Einstein writes these letters famously to Franklin Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt is like, well, this seems like this could be a big deal. Like, military, get on it. And the military does absolutely nothing. What ends up happening is Britain convenes this committee called the MAUD Committee that sort of come up with a blueprint for making an atomic bomb and come over and present it to the US and say, like, this is how long it's going to take. This is how much money it's going to take, and sort of finally gets the US moving. But I think sort of for as much as we think of World War II in the way that we sort of think of it in buildings like this as, the battles and the combat and the planes, it was the industrial might of the United States that really ends up winning the war. That's what outlasts both Germany and Japan. And that it's sort of, as much as we think of the sort of heroes of World War II as the combat riflemen and infantrymen and pilots and paratroopers, this was as much a scientists and mathematicians war when you look at the way that the transformational inflection points in the war come from, the cryptography breaking of, Enigma and the German codes and the Japanese codes, the development of radar, the development of the proximity fuse, the development at the end of the atomic bomb. And that totally transforms and rewrites the relationship between government and science. Because before World War II, there was no effective government support or relationship between scientists and government. And that was really what these physicists were struggling with, was they were coming they were coming from authoritarian fascist regimes like Italy, like Germany, where they understood the governments directed everything. And so, of course, the governments were really tuned into the cutting edge of science, because in a fascist regime, like, the scientists didn't do any work that the government didn't want them to be doing. And so they get over to our free society and are like, the scientists just sort of go off and do the work that they're interested in, and then, like, the government doesn't tell them what to be doing? And, like, how does that work?
Well, it changes the role of universities as well.
It changes universities, and you know, it just totally changes. And when you look at sort of all of the economic success that the U.S. has in the post-war decades, you know, so much of that comes from the way that we rethink the relationship between government support of science during World War II to, you know, help fund universities, help fund, you know, the labs at places like Los Alamos and Livermore and, you know, sort of the national labs that grow out of the Manhattan Project.
Still exist today in some cases.
And are still with us today, yeah.
Absolutely. I want to pivot from sort of the scientific and industrial side of it to the actual other anniversary we have coming up this year in 2025, which is the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you talk extensively about the sort of trajectory of the Pacific War, which I think is the critical context for understanding Truman's decision to drop the bomb. I'm thinking especially about Operation Meeting House, the spring of 1945, where American B-29s firebombed Tokyo, and that's one of only a handful, or one of a number of cities, I should say, that are firebombed in this period. I mean, Meeting House kills perhaps as many as 100,000 Japanese in firebombing, which is more than either of the atomic bombs, according to many of the estimates. So you talk extensively about the background of the Pacific War, the firebombing campaign in 44-45, and you say that this backdrop creates a, quote, permission structure that impacts the decision to use the atomic bombs. I wonder if you could tell us more about how you view that trajectory and that permission structure that leads up to Truman's momentous decision in August of 45.
Yeah, and this is probably not true of an audience at the National World War II Museum, but I think most Americans don't understand the scale of the devastation of the bombing raids against Japan in the final sort of 6 months, 9 months of the war.
This deadly sort of culmination, really.
Yeah, that we sort of island hop across the Pacific. And what that really was all about was seizing the airfields that got us close enough to actually be able to bomb the homeland in Japan. And that's where we get to sort of Saipan and Tinian, which is the big B-29 base, about 1,500 miles from the Japanese home islands. And we can sort of begin to send out these massive multi-hundred bomber raids against Japanese cities. And the U.S. spends months on sort of what we call high-level strategic bombing, which is basically what we did against most of Germany through the European theater. And I'm slightly oversimplifying the complexities of 2 giant theaters of war for the purposes of book discussion here. But the strategic bombing just sort of doesn't really work. The bombs do hit ground because gravity works, but like generally don't hit anywhere close to where they're supposed to hit, and we're not making a huge impact on war industry. And then Curtis LeMay arrives and he says, let's just burn out the Japanese cities. And we're going to send in these bombers in huge numbers, low with napalm and fire bombs, and we're just going to burn these cities. And Japanese cities at that time are mostly wood. They burn. So Operation Meeting House, as you said, sort of the first big Tokyo raid. In a single night, we killed probably 100,000 people in Tokyo, which is the deadliest single night of warfare in human history. And it is, something that gets almost no mention in any meaningful history of the war. And it works really well. And so Curtis LeMay does it night after night after night, targeting 66 cities across Japan, burning in, single nights somewhere between, 30, 40, 70% of each of these cities. And there's an incredible map in sort of the final room of the Road to Tokyo, which I now turned around, but maybe it's that way. That's, sort of the map of these 66 cities, the percentage of each of the cities that is destroyed, and then sort of the American city that is the equivalent size of these Japanese cities. And it's, Cleveland and Fort Worth and, New York that we're burning on a nightly basis. The irony, of course, is that the Manhattan Project ends up coming up with its target list, which includes Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those cities are actually reserved from Curtis LeMay's bombing so that they can be saved to be hit by the atomic bomb. Because the US war planners realize, we are so effective at destroying Japanese cities now that if we drop an atomic bomb on a city we've already firebombed, it's going to be impossible to tell that these bombs are particularly powerful because so much of the city will already be destroyed. And so there's this great irony, and you actually hear the residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki talk about this in the book, because they're spending the whole spring and summer of 1945 wondering why their city hasn't gotten burned yet. They're reading the newspapers and hearing the news reports and talking to their family members about all of these other cities that are getting burned to the ground, and they're like, we haven't seen a single bomber come over the city of Hiroshima. And we sort of always wondered what night was going to be our night.
I want to ask about, those sources. I think what's incredibly impressive about the book is just the number of voices you bring in, as you do in your other works as well. You say you mined more than 100 books, dozens of archives all over the world, more than 500 voices in the book. What surprised you the most in this research? What was the most interesting thing you came across? What was the most surprising voice that you found, or perhaps a perspective that you hadn't even thought about before?
Yeah. So I first have to give a special shout out here to the National World War II Museum, which Bradley did not tell me to do. But Tony Kaiser, who is somewhere, I think, over there, who is the curator here, was a huge help to me on both this book and the D-Day book. And the archives that are here are just in literal national treasure. And all of you who are here and support the museum should be really proud of the research materials and the sort of facility and access that you all have helped provide here, because it's just incredible. And so for the D-Day book, I read about 2,000 oral histories, probably about a roughly similar number for this one. World War II veterans, the scientists, the Manhattan district staff, and then the Haibakusa, the Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think what really comes through, again, the scale of the Manhattan Project is something that, Oppenheimer was a great movie. I loved it. I have seen it multiple times. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's awesome. But we way oversimplify the Manhattan Project to basically J. Robert Oppenheimer. It was this industrial effort, coming back to the sort of the industrial project and the industrial strength of the war. The communities at Oak Ridge, where we made uranium, and Hanford, Washington, where we made plutonium for the bombs. I mean, these were elements that existed. Plutonium existed in only microscopic amounts at the start of World War II. It was something that literally no one had viewed but in a microscope. And we were building factories to manufacture it at the hundreds of kilograms level. The Hanford, Washington plant was the largest construction site in the United States. It was 80 miles wide by 80 miles deep. It employed 100,000 people who lived in this incredibly secret community that had been built in the Washington State desert. Like, you don't think Washington State has a desert. It actually has a desert that is drier than West Texas. And we built these incredible facilities for manufacturing plutonium. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 85,000 people go into this secret city in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, again, carved out of the Tennessee hills, out of literal forest and mountain valleys that were entirely that was very insulting to the people who did live there. That was mostly uninhabited at the start of the war. The Oak Ridge facility mass transit system was one of the 10 busiest mass transit systems in the entire United States on the day that the World War II ended. It was a city that did not exist on maps, that no one had heard of, and that Harry Truman announced its existence over the radio on the afternoon of August 6th when he announced the bombing of Hiroshima. And so I think what really comes through in these oral histories is this scale and scope. So the Oak Ridge, the center of the Oak Ridge production facilities are these things called calutrons that are basically like where they make the uranium. Anyone who's a nuclear physicist will hate my summary of the system, but it's where you make the uranium. Tennessee Eastman, division of Eastman Kodak, is the company that the Manhattan Engineer District brings in to run these Oak Ridge factories. And what they do is they're trying to figure out where their workforce is going to be. Who's left in rural Tennessee but young women high school grads? And so most of the calutron operators in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, are girls just out of high school in Tennessee who go in to operate these machines. And the workforce in Oak Ridge is, heavily, very young single women with a high school education who are working on the literal most advanced technology being developed in the entire world and never understand what the thing is that they're doing. Like, they work there the entire war operating these machines and working these switches in their 8-hour shifts. And then on August 6th, in this radio address, they hear the word uranium for the first time. And they're like, oh, that's the thing that was coming out the back end of the machine for these last couple of years. But there's this great moment in the book where they take these high school grads and put them up against the nuclear physicists from Berkeley who actually developed the system for developing uranium. And the high school girls way outperform the nuclear physicists at the production of uranium in this very high stakes competition, proving that they are actually better at working these machines than the PhD nuclear physicists. And
in addition to that, obviously, not only size, but secrecy level, right? This was entirely, as you said, secret throughout the entirety of the Manhattan Project, and only becomes announced later, effectively. Yeah. So, something that's hard to imagine today in our interconnected age, I guess, of something like that existing entirely in secrecy. I have one final question before we open up to our audience for questions, and I'm going to do the obnoxious thing of turning one of your own questions back on yourself. In the first pages of the book, you pose two questions that you say will, quote, never be fully settled. I'm going to pose them to you. And you say, quote, was the use of the bombs necessary, meaning the atomic bombs, and was Japan close to surrendering anyway? And those are the two questions that, of course, I agree with you, will probably never be fully settled to everyone's satisfaction. But writing a 500-page book, you must have an opinion on those questions. I wonder if you'd share it with us.
So I think I settle all of the following are simultaneously true. And I'm going to try to keep these as factual statements and not as moral judgments. The dropping of the atomic bomb certainly saves American lives. It probably saves Japanese lives as well. Japan is in really bad shape by the summer of 45 because of the naval blockade that the US is sort of slowly strangling Japan with. And Japan is hitting a point where there are about 200,000 Japanese civilians starving to death each month in the summer of 45, which is, again, one of those parts of the history of World War II that we don't really, I think, talk about or sort of understand enough. In a very cold calculation of lives, the war ending in August versus November, that's 800,000 Japanese lives, maybe 1 million Japanese civilian lives.
Assuming it even ends in November.
Assuming it ends in November. Also true at the same time is we don't really understand what we are doing when we are dropping in the atomic bomb. We don't really understand radiation. We don't really understand the downstream effects of radiation poisoning. There's sort of some hints of that, but we certainly don't understand it in the way that we now understand it. And again, when you go back to thinking about who the people are who are making this decision in the summer of 45, they don't know that Japan is about to surrender. They are looking at a war that might go on for another year. When you sort of put those pieces of the puzzle on the table, when you think about what another couple of months of our firebombing of Japanese cities would do to Japan, there's a lot of speculation, I think, in the revisionist history that you see sort of from the 1990s on, that, this was a terrible mistake, that we never should have done this, that it's actually Russia, the Soviet Union's entry into the war that causes Japan to surrender. It has nothing to do with the atomic bombings. What we have pieced together of the decision-making within the Japanese government means that's not true. And what I mean by that is Emperor Hirohito himself cites the atomic bombings in his surrender decision, which I think we have to take as relatively strong evidence that those mattered to him. What we also understand now, which of course Truman and his team and Curtis LeMay and Henry Stimson and all of the US decision makers had no visibility into, is Japan was not particularly close to surrendering even after the first atomic bombing. And that the emperor, the sort of hard right part of the cabinet and the military were really committed to fighting on.
There's a coup.
There is a coup the night before the surrender, on the night of August 14th, where hardliners in the Japanese military storm the emperor's palace to try to seize and destroy the audio record onto which the emperor's surrender announcement has been recorded, in order to stop Japan from surrendering the next day, even after the second atomic bombing. They do not succeed in that coup on the night of August 14th because the record has actually been hidden in the women's portion of the palace, which the military coup leaders refused to go into for reasons of propriety, which tells you sort of a really fascinating insight into Japanese society at the time, that you're like, we'll stage the coup, but we won't go into the women's portion of the palace. And so, the surrender sort of only barely happens on the 15th anyway. So all of that said, I think at the same time, it is correct that we have made the defining focus of international geopolitics since August 9th, 1945, to never use these weapons again. And I think one of the things I want to do with this book at this moment, as we watch the memories of the atomic bomb shift from living memory into history, is remind people that these are not any other weapon. That these are nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons are a fundamentally different category of destruction. As you heard, my sort of second book on America's nuclear system, I wrote a book about doomsday planning in the Cold War called Raven Rock. I come away from sort of both of those projects with this like ever stronger conviction that, we just have to make sure that we never use nuclear weapons again.
Unfortunately, never have been used since.
And have never used them since. But today, in a very weird echo of history, are probably closer to the use of nuclear weapons in today's world than we have been at almost any time, in the last 30, 40 years since the early 1980s. We've seen already this spring conflict between India and Pakistan, which would be the two largest nuclear arsenals to ever come into open warfare. We've seen the attacks on Iran's nuclear system. The US and Russia and China are all in the midst of multi-trillion-dollar upgrades to our nuclear systems, building new nuclear weapons right now as we speak. When you go to Hiroshima, when you go to Nagasaki, which I hope if any of you ever have the chance, you go, what you understand is that these are not weapons of war, that these are community destroying weapons, both in the way that they sort of destroy human civilization in the way that they are used, but also in the way that they poison communities forever. That sort of the thing that comes through when you read like hundreds of the Hayabusa oral histories and testimonies, when you are a victim of these bombs, even if you live, you spend every day of the rest of your life wondering if you will still be a victim of the bomb. That, like if you survive the European war, like you come home and you have survived the European war. And for the residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they watch their family members die, weeks after, months after, years after, decades after, of the after effects of these bombs in ways that just destroy, a community and a people for, generations. And I think, in a sort of a roundabout way, I think if you go back, as I sort of try to do in this entire book, and the whole project was to do this, put yourself in the shoes of the people who are making these decisions in the spring and summer of 1945. They probably made the right decision based on the information that was available to them. And at the same time, now that we know more than they did, we have to make sure that we never use these things again.
A thought-provoking way to open up our Q&A session here. I believe we have some mics going around here.
We're going to start in the back, but first, let's get a round of applause for Bradley Hart and Garrett Graff.
And I should say, I'm happy to talk about D-Day too. I know I'm in sort of like the heart of D-Day world as well, so I'm happy to talk about that as well.
So I guess I'll start it off here. I formulated the question when you were talking earlier about the sort of the size of the facilities of the Manhattan Project. I'm an engineer who works in the nuclear power space, and I work in the safety aspect of it, and we're constantly trying to sort of define the statistics and, the size of different incidents and, how much power is generated, et cetera. There's always this statistic that 15%, 14% of the total U.S. power generating capacity was taken by the Manhattan Project at the time. And I read recently that it's closer to 1%. And I guess I'm just trying to define sort of the equity the United States has put into this power generation technology. We're always trying to define these statistics. So I just wondered if you have any more specifics on that, like as to what the true size of the project was from like a data perspective?
Yeah, I don't remember the power percentage off the top of my head, but in the scope of even 1% of the entire U.S. power generation going into this one project during the war would have been an enormous use of it. It is incredible sort of looking at, when you go through it, the scale of the resources that we end up devoting to it. There's like a shortage of tires at one point in the country because of the, one of the elements that the Manhattan Project needs to sort of hoover up absolutely everything that it can. There's a moment where, they need more copper wire and they just can't get enough copper wire. And so they realize that they can use silver wire instead. And so they go to the Treasury and ask for withdrawal from the silver deposits at West Point. And, the Treasury official says, how many troy ounces do you need? And the guy says 13 tons, like how, and the Treasury guy is like, how many of that, how much of that is in troy ounces? And they're like, I have no idea.
Next question. We're going to go to your left, about halfway back, gentlemen.
Did Truman or any of his advisors ever express any regret about the dropping of the bomb?
Truman didn't. A lot of the scientists did. Oppenheimer sort of very famously does. And in fact, it's the movement of the atomic scientists to sort of turn against nuclear weapons after the war that, creates a lot of the anti-nuclear movement. But in that moment, again, they're in the middle of this war. And one of the things that, was really striking to me, I have sort of the chapter after the bombing of Hiroshima, where all of the Manhattan Project scientists sort of learn of the success of the bombing of Hiroshima for the first time after that Truman press conference. A lot of them have family members that are poised to be part of the invasion of Japan. A lot of them are standing there, in Los Alamos, saying like, my brother is on a troop ship, waiting off the Japanese shore. My brother was a flamethrower on Okinawa and, is headed into the second wave of an invasion in Tokyo. And my brother is, just finished the war in Europe and is part of the 1.5 million people who don't get to go home from the European war and are just being shipped across the country and right out the other coast, to go on to the Pacific. And, for them, a lot of them, it's very personal that, they can name their family members who will live because of the bomb that they were able to create. I will also say, if I was correct in watching people as the introductions were made, that's the row of teachers. And I should say, I dedicated my D-Day book to my history teachers, including my first grade teacher, Mrs. Stochek, who was a huge part of getting me interested in history. And I am just so grateful to all of you for the work that you do to sort of get people interested in history and help keep these stories alive. So thank you all.
Teachers matter.
Yeah.
Teachers matter.
Gentlemen, we're going to go to your left towards the front in just a moment.
Thank you for being here. At the end of the war, we had the 3 bombs, the test bomb and the 2 bombs that were dropped. And we did not have any other bomb ready. Hypothetically, we dropped the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war continues. How far were we out from having a 4th weapon?
Yeah. I'm not going to get this exactly right, but we would have had sort of one more bomb in August. And then the sort of plan hope was, 2 to 3 bombs a month thereafter. It's a little bit hard now because there's a lot of speculation about sort of what was a real war plan and what wasn't, for the actual invasion. But there was a plan for the sort of main invasion of the Japanese home islands that would have started in the fall of 45. They had a plan for using 9 atomic bombs to support the invasion. There was going to be sort of 3 main invasion landings, and there were going to be 3 bombs dedicated to each of the 3 landings. So it's a little bit unclear, and we'll sort of never know now what the exact cadence of the bombs would have been. There was a lot of discussion that a third one might have just been dropped on Tokyo, that sort of our, patience was running out. And like, if the, 2 bombs on the outer cities didn't work, maybe we actually just hit Tokyo. But then there was this other war plan that we would use 9 of them in pretty quick succession in, around November.
We're going to stay to your left towards the front, please.
I had the chance to tour Nagasaki and go to the Good Museum at Ground Zero. And at the time, I was an infantry battalion commander, and they gave us, the senior folks in my unit, a special tour of the museum, which was a little surprising. But the thing probably that surprised me most was 44 years later, how Nagasaki was a dense, modern, thriving city, including, Ground Zero.
Yeah.
So I've had some discussions, over the years, and particularly the recriminations come about, how could we drop the bomb on these poor Japanese people, some of which you alluded to. But, some of our discussions with people that we've talked to is maybe the greatest beneficiaries of dropping the bomb were the Japanese. Because if the firebombing had gone on and so many more Japanese would have been killed, if we'd had a homeland invasion and they continued to be their philosophy of, everybody fights to the end, civilian, military, et cetera, so many more Japanese would have been, as you alluded to, maybe even more numbers than you indicated, but also more Americans would have been killed. And our whole outlook on Japan and being, beneficial conquerors as opposed to much more, retribution against the country. So the combination of we left Japan with much more of their population and some of their infrastructure than if the thing had gone forward. And we had the goodwill left enough to, help them come back and be the very successful country they are now. Whereas if we hadn't dropped the bomb, it would have been totally different. So that theory goes the greatest beneficiaries of the bomb being dropped were the Japanese. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of, thinking.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this has to do with, as you point out, the way that the U.S. approaches the end of the war, which is 80 years on. Both Japan and Germany are some of the sort of strongest economies and strongest democracies in the world. And that is an incredible testament, actually, again, to America's industrial might and sort of the way that the government approaches those two countries after the war. Again, sort of unlike almost any other country approaching a conquered, defeated enemy at the end of a war in almost all of human history. And I think that the thing that America gets the most right at the end of World War II, the thing that sets America up for what is probably the greatest half century of American history and economic progress and social equality in our entire history, is that we understood the things that we had coming out of the war that worked and invested in them. And I'm talking both about Japan and Germany and the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe and the American occupation in Japan, which is an enormous success story. Again, not just in Nagasaki, but Hiroshima is the same, incredibly advanced modern city. Tokyo today, a city, again, as we mentioned, that we burned to the ground in the spring of 45, is the biggest, most modern city in the world. And then here at home, our investments in things like the GI Bill, the understanding and embrace of the change in our funding for science and our investments in countries overseas through science and education. I mean, it's just tremendous, and so much of it, I think, has to do with, as you say, the goodwill that America ends these two incredibly horrific wars. And by the way, we have a really clear contrast between that and what the Soviet Union did, where it went into the sort of conquered Japanese corners of China. It went into the countries in behind the Iron Curtain, and was picking up the railroad tracks and shipping them back to Russia to use there. And we approached the end of the war with this incredible magnanimity that I think is the thing that America gets the most right about the end of the war.
And the bottom line, my question was, dropping the atom bomb, in fact, allow that kind of relationship and with Japan, because we had a very culturally different relationship with Japan and than we did with Germany.
Yes.
And so just by default, we thought the Japanese were much worse than our European, German, ancestors, et cetera. So without the bomb being dropped and the war stopping at that point and having to put a lot more capital, human and otherwise, into the war and destroying so much more of Japan, what I was trying to get at is the dropping of the bomb really, is Japan the best beneficiary of that? Because otherwise, when you look at culturally as well as, this great outlook we had would have been, I think, potentially very different.
Yes.
If we had to do the invasion and we'd fought the last man kind of thing, or even a lot further. So trying to pin you down on that.
And I think you're probably right on that, because again, these bombs aren't dropped in a vacuum, right? Like the kamikaze attacks are, killing Americans at a rate that, is unlike anything else that we're experiencing in the war. We're losing more troops or more personnel on the ships offshore, than we are on the islands in some of these final campaigns. It is a brutal fight to the death for every inch of those islands going up. I mean, the numbers of on most of these islands, and you probably know these statistics better than I do for some of the islands, we're killing 99%, 99.9% of the Japanese on a lot of these islands. 1% of them are surrendering at the end of a battle. I mean, this is nothing like the final stages of the war in Europe, where you're sort of getting whole German units who are marching with their arms up towards the American lines. I mean, this is a brutal fight, unlike anything that we'd experienced.
The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb. Garrett Graff and Bradley Hart.
That was great. That was great.
Our thanks to Garrett M. Graff for sharing his work with us here at the National World War II Museum. Be sure to subscribe to World War II On Topic to get access to our latest content when it comes out. And be sure to visit us in person next time you're here in New Orleans.